Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Hamre, the president of CSIS, and the one advantage of being president is I get to do all the fun things. And today is one of those fun things. I get to discuss with an author a remarkable new book. This is a book, it's called Genesis. Oh, I don't know if you can see it here. Genesis, the subtitle is Artificial Intelligence, Hope, and the Human Spirit. And there were three authors to this. Henry Kissinger, who was for 40 years a trustee at CSIS. I was amazed at the last part of his life. He devoted it to artificial intelligence. Craig Mundie, and I'll say a minute in a word, a minute in a minute, I'll say a word about Craig, and then Eric Schmidt, who was with Google. Let me just say a word about about Craig Mundie. I met Craig, I guess maybe 27 years ago. He came to Washington to tell me I was all wrong and I had everything screwed up. Now, this was back when I was at DOD, and the DoD enterprise was trying to push a universal encryption chip called the Fortessa, and it was designed so that everything could be encrypted, but we could see everything. And of course, Craig Mundie thought that was the worst goddamn thing in the world. So he came to Washington to tell me that. And we had a series of very interesting conversations. And I came to realize Craig was right. And I learned a lot from that exchange. And this was back when Craig was at Microsoft. He was at Microsoft for many, many years. And he's become a great friend. And I'm just really delighted that he is joining us today to discuss this remarkable book, and it really is Genesis, Artificial Intelligence, Hope, and the Human Spirit. Craig Mundie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here, and your memory is good, going all the way back to our origin together.
well, it wasn't always painful, Craig, or it wasn't always joyful, Craig. It was painful at times, but
the other half of it that you didn't tell, though, was that the government broadly was also trying to do export controls on encryption technology, and it was only through your help that we managed to get all the interagency to come around. So I appreciated that.
I realized at the time, and this was the breakthrough moment for me, is that I could win tactically, but I would lose strategically if we prevailed. And you helped me do that, helped me realize that, Craig. So I want to say thank you. Now let's get into this book. This is a fascinating book. There are all kinds of AI books that are out there. This one's really different. I mean, this takes you, intermediately from, the level of insight into technology, insight into human nature. It makes you have a conversation about both of those things. So let me just start, Craig, to ask you. I mean, it's funny the way you started it. You are the three authors. I don't know who all wrote it. It's really fascinating. The first way you begin in this book is you talk about the age of discovery, Magellan setting off and going around the world, about these early pioneers who didn't understand what they were looking at, but this impulse of inquiry. Why did you start your book with that?
Well, I think, and the answer is we collectively wrote the book. I mean, Henry, I think particularly had his contribution was around the philosophy and history perspectives, because he was focused on that, and Eric and I less so. But he was our mentor in that regard. But we started the book that way because we think that ultimately this is mankind's biggest invention, and through it, it's going to allow us to go off in a new age of discovery, so to speak, that really transcends what we've been able to do before. And so we talk about in the beginning, the idea that you need curious people who take the emerging new tools of the day, particularly around science and engineering, and use them to drive forward and to do things that people haven't done before. And we think that the emergence of this super intelligence is going to be the greatest tool we've ever had for discovery. And so we want to make people realize this is not just a small tweak to humanity's capabilities.
But a giant leap. It's interesting in that the very first part you talk about this age of discovery, and then you pivot in the book to talk about the incredible role that polymaths have played historically. Would you just kind of, for the audience, shape what's a polymath? What is that history, and what does it mean here in the context of your book?
Well, I mean, historically, polymaths are individuals who are domain experts in multiple domains. And most people don't have either the time or the IQ to be an expert in many domains. And so polymaths sort of emerged naturally over time. Their own curiosity and intellect allowed them to have insights or learn things or integrate things that the average person couldn't do. And the reason we, in the book, talk about polymaths, in the beginning, these very rare individuals were recognized often as having, important capabilities. And if you will, the rulers or the prominent people of the time, tended to either value them or fear them. And when they were valued, they influenced, where the society went by getting the people who were in control to do things they might not have thought about before. And the analogy here is that I believe that these super intelligent machines are going to be the ultimate polymaths. And in fact, they will exceed the polymathic capability of any human or even any collective set of humans. And that's perhaps one of its greatest gifts, but is also one of the things that makes it a bit confounding for people who for years have been at the top of the IQ pyramid and able to think that they were the ones that were going to have the insights or were going to be able to understand them when they were had by others. And that may no longer be true.
Craig, let me just quote out. This is from page 28 of the book. I'm just going to read this directly. Just as the achievements of Enlightenment polymaths depended on interconnection of information, the recent advances in machine learning have made possible only by the sheer scale of data the collective intelligence that has been not only enabled but made readily accessible by AI. Why don't you amplify on that?
Well, happily, humans have found a digital representation for almost everything we've found interesting. And as the internet emerged and everybody got connected, we ended up inadvertently creating a global repository of a huge amount of knowledge and information. And that repository turned out to be essential in capitalizing on these powerful new machines in order to train an artificial brain. So much the way humans, start in the crib and they look around and they see their parents and they see the mobile and they see their toys, they're essentially starting with nothing and sort of putting it all together, and their brain grows in capability. These machines basically grow up the same way. The difference is they have finer resolution in the senses, and they have an operating speed that's many orders of magnitude greater than a human. And as a result, they can not only kind of learn everything a human learns in a short amount of time, the new ones basically learn everything that is publicly available on a global basis in about 6 months' time. Mm-hmm. So they go from essentially, no knowledge to complete knowledge. And because this knowledge is all in one brain, not distributed into a lot of brains or even a handful of polymaths' brains, the ability for this thing to integrate all this information together to find new solutions to things exceeds anything that humans have ever been able to do, and frankly, would ever be able to do, at least as we are today. And so that's where the potency of these things comes from, and why the term artificial general intelligence, was used to distinguish it from the classical ideas of machine learning, where the machine learning, you were trying to teach the machine to do some predictive thing in a narrow domain where you had some training data. Here, we're actually trying to create a general intelligence that is at least as smart as humans in every domain, but do it in a single brain. And in fact, what we're finding is that it not only can match what a human can do in every domain, but it can exceed what they can do. And this is sort of the subtle distinction between perhaps super intelligence, and just artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you. I mean, as I understand, and I'm not. I thought Gigahertz was a French car rental company, so I'm to have no technical capabilities whatsoever. But as I understand it, these new AI tools are really just getting giant amounts of information from all over, and they're assembling it and they're evaluating it and they're creating probabilistic relationships of things that they've accumulated and putting it into some kind of a structure. But this all comes from an era when there was a certain, intellectual self-awareness of ourselves. We knew what we were writing. We wrote for a purpose. We weren't communicating the emotions that we felt, but we were communicating the impressions we wanted people to have of us. To what degree do you think these computers, these AI programs, have because they don't have a capacity of self-assessment at this stage, but maybe that's coming. What is the capacity of reflection, given that the data that they've been using to build this knowledge base constitutes a kind of a cynical self-reflection that humans have about themselves?
Well, I think first you have to understand that this is all evolving very quickly. In fact, just in terms of this, I don't know if you want to call it reflection or self-awareness or whatever, but the newest models, in fact, the ones that have just been released in the last week or so, now have this internal ability to recurse as it works on a problem. The ones that we started with ChatGPT 2 years ago, last month, they were kind of single shot passes through the network. You put in some conditioning, context, and then asked a question. It went once through your brain network, and out came an answer, and it would iterate around that to produce a sequence. But now you can actually tell it you want it to think harder, that you want more assurances that this thing is right, and the machine will essentially think longer. It'll think deeper in quite literal terms about that before it starts to produce answers. And so, it's moving in the same direction, I think, that people are, where they're moving toward what we think of in humans as agency, the ability to take a problem and decompose it and then figure out how to operationalize it. And this agency, or what we call agentic behavior, will probably be the big thing in AI in 2025. So these things are rapidly getting there. The other thing that's different right now is today, the machine has no embodiment. In a sense, the fact that we've digitized everything means that we just feed it into the brain of this machine, with all of its ultimate resolution, as a digital bit string. And it doesn't experience the world directly itself. But that too will change. People now are starting to couple the historical progress in robots, whether anthropomorphic robots or not, and that gives the machine the ability to operate directly in the world.
Yeah.
And so at that point, you don't know whether it couldn't, be exposed to and learn, all the other elements of what it means to be human or interact with humans. And Uh, and so, I don't think that there's a fundamental impediment where this basic neural network construct, as it evolves, I mean, it's not all the way there yet, wouldn't be able to learn them to the same degree that a human does.
Yeah. About a third of the way, when you take us through the introduction about, global explorers and then polymaths, you take us to a very, probably the central issue question of the book, and that is philosophers call it epistemology. How do we
Mm-hmm.
know what we know? And the thesis you outline here is that we're never going to know how an AI program thinks. Would you explain this some more for our audience?
Well, to some extent, we don't really know how humans think either. All right. So we get comfortable, over time, either by experience or other validation mechanisms, or to some extent, you build trust. And so it turns out that today the human mind is not substantially less opaque in how it really does what it does than the machines are. And while they, at a technological level, don't operate exactly the same way, the basic constructs are not that far apart. So as we go forward, though, the challenge we have is how do we build this trust? Because in the past, we could interact with humans, we could have experience with humans, and to some extent, some humans could try to reproduce the work of other humans in order to validate this. And the thing that is going to be more challenging is because the machine is polymathic at a degree that humans will never be, the machine will do things that we can't anticipate and may not even understand once they've happened. And so the idea that, we could control it a priori is ultimately specious because we can't even anticipate what it's going to do. So you can't write rules for things you can't anticipate or understand. And therefore, we have to come up with some other way of both building this trust mechanism up and then ensuring that, the machine lives within what is I'll say a long-term symbiotic relationship with humans.
You just said something really very important, that we can't write rules for what we don't understand. Very, very interesting. Now, if on page 71 of your book, this is under the section of what is physicality, you write, indeed, today's AI leaders are insistent that we not entrust digital agents with control over direct physical experiments. So long as AI remains flawed, indeed deeply flawed as they are today, this is a wise precaution. Now, this sounds like a guardrail that you're putting up, that we should think as a society to manage something like AI. Would you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I want to be precise about the use of the word guardrail. You hear that term a lot, but today the guardrails are all programmatic, that are trying to limit what the machines will do in this, I'll call it, disembodied form. And so the paragraph you cite from the book is pointing out that, and I mentioned it earlier, if the machine was embodied and it could both learn and act directly in the real world without human involvement, then it becomes much harder, to constrain what it might do or how it might learn. And so later in the book, we talk about the fact that we at least see the outlines of how we can build this kind of trust, an adjudication mechanism. But until we have comfort that we're doing that, and in fact that we're all doing it in some uniform way, then you might want to say, not as a guardrail, but just as a guideline, you should be extremely cautious about letting the machine act directly through, without any form of intermediation by humans, simply because it's kind of like saying, well, at what age do you let your teenager start driving? All right. Up to that point, you say, well, there's a limit to what they can do, who they can run into or do. But at some point you have to say, all right, I'm going to let them go. And I think we're sort of in the early teen years here for our machines in that regard. And we have to make a very conscious decision when and how and with what devices, we want to let them act, without the ability for humans to be involved. Ultimately, I think we will go past that. But what we're suggesting in the book is that you want to be cautious about that until we've agreed that we have a trust and adjudication system that can basically act in our stead on the problems that we wouldn't be able to adjudicate ourselves anyway.
Well, let me make this really kind of pointed. We're seeing unprecedented use of remotely piloted vehicles for warfare in Ukraine. Let's assume that we can put an AI program behind that so that they become autonomous. How do you feel about that as an idea, Craig? I mean, the idea that we could launch a machine, it has a warhead on it, it can fly out and find something to destroy on its own. How do you feel about that?
Hypothetically, I have no problem with that. The thing that I have angst on over today is that we don't have a human level way of adjudicating those uses. So the thing that, that the defense folks would call human in the loop, is sort of the idea that, okay, these machines have capabilities, but before certain things happen, I want the human in the loop. What they're implying is that the human has judgment, based on stuff that you can't fully explain, that, will allow them to enforce these things where the machine hasn't been taught how to do that, or we aren't sure that it has the capability to do that. Now, we've seen this well before the AI has emerged, but now the AI is creating this incredible acceleration at the rate where these machines are capable of doing this. But it's not just in warfare. I mean, people have some similar concerns about that in biology and medicine and other areas where at what point do you just let it rip, But what we're finding is that the machines are clearly demonstrating a superior ability to execute the mission. What we aren't yet able to do is to say we trust that they'll do that in a way which comports with what we have established as, I'll say in military terms, the rules of engagement,
right?
And the unwritten rules of engagement, which somehow come back to this question of morality or human values. And we think we're all grounded in these things. Now, we all know that not all humans are equally grounded in these things. But the interesting thing the book also talks about is a thing called the doxa. The doxa is interesting because it's a term and a concept that I learned about from some cultural anthropologists, where they have discovered that there is essentially kind of an almost folkloric pass down in all societies of a common set of human moral reasoning and values. And these are not innate, you're not born with them, but almost all societies appear to have them the same. And so it's these things that you could say ground most humans when the rules fail them. And, the thing I was elated to find was that, in fact, the doxa is a learned thing. And therefore, if I can find a way to learn it by the machine, then there's no reason it can't be grounded at the end of the day in exactly the same system that humans are grounded in. And that's important when you're trying to build toward a trust model that says, I not only have to be able to comport with the expressed rules and regulations of societies, I have to be able to comport with the ones that are the unwritten human values as well. And I now believe that both of those are possible. Well, and in fact, can be done at a scale and that humans have not been able to achieve themselves.
Yeah, gosh, this is fascinating, and I'm intensely interested in this issue. I'm coming from a defense background. I mean, we spend a lot of time to have a human in the loop on targeting, so that we only hit things that we know we want to target. You say it's that.
But that's been shown to be not perfect either.
It's not at all perfect. And I remember looking at the air war in Kosovo. Out of 10,000 airstrikes, we had 20 that were flawed. And one of them was deeply flawed. We hit exactly what we wanted. It was just the wrong thing. And that was the Chinese embassy. Right. But, but when you say that it's that the human has that, human in the loop is not just judgment, it's accountability. It's that there is a legal accountability for what we did. What happens when it's a machine?
Well, I think that this is one of the questions that as a society we have to come to grips with. I kind of go the other way. I mean, I'll make this up as I go, but if you have, a dog that's trained, and you tell the dog, go out and do something, and the dog, goes off and chews on somebody, is the dog accountable or is the human accountable? And we sort of think, well, maybe it's the human still. The question here is, we're going to have something at the other end of the scale, which is more intelligent than we are. In the book, we talk about this evolution of our relationship of the human species to these machines. And we're now at the first stage we think of as the tool stage. That's as far as we've ever gotten before. We've always made tools to improve and amplify our capabilities. This is the first time where we are building something that goes beyond tools, and that it is going to be able to do things that we can't do, that it is just smarter than we are. So in the book, we say this second stage I call coexistence. And at this point in time, we coexist because we've come to the realization that this thing, except for the fact that it's not biological based, is another species. It has all the other attributes that we ascribe to a species. It just doesn't happen to be carbon based. And so this is sort of where, Henry and we push forward to say, okay, now you got to think, all right, I've got another thing here. I have to have a relationship with it. It's as intelligent or more than we are. What is our agreement with this thing? And for me, the good news is we at least still have time now, because we're building this intelligence, to imbue it with certain properties that buy us the time for this long adjustment period, and adjusting everything, including these questions of accountability and trust, in a now environment where we have multiple intelligent species and they have to coexist. This is a period of time where once we start to trust it, it becomes a tool for humans to adjust ourselves and our societies. And, we don't know how that'll happen and play out, but this is where Henry, also pointed
Yeah.
out that, the printing press was the last big one, that ultimately trickled out into a total change in our societies. The end of, mostly kingdoms and fiefdoms and the emergence through the Treaty of Westphalia of the nation
Yeah.
state as we know it.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
the question is, if you go down the road 100 years, where do we decide that all ends up again?
Yeah.
And, and I think we're taking the very first steps of Enlightenment 2.0.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't know where it leads. But the final step is ultimately coevolution, that, humans as a species will be evolving, but through design, not by classical methods of evolution. And then the machine will be adjusting at the same time. And, that's what we have to ponder.
Yeah, I want to save the last 15 minutes or so for exactly that question, but forgive my little compulsiveness here. I want to stay on this defense question. We, the U.S., Europe, I think, we adhere to the Geneva Conventions, and we explicitly say we will not attack a medical facility, a hospital, a clinic. Because we're prohibited by doing that from the Geneva Conventions. Russia, during the tragic war in Syria, intentionally attacked hospitals and clinics. So if this is a technology widely available, not just to us, but to bad guys, how do we evolve to an accepted norm about how to live with these new machines?
Well, this in the book, when I talk about the total architecture of safety and alignment, I think of it not the way it's discussed today as sort of a strictly technological, rule writing kind of way, but one that actually has to get much deeper down to these sort of philosophical and doxa-like groundings. But in addition, you have to then deal, okay, well, if you have a mechanism whereby an AI can provide these supervisory functions to other AIs, then you can talk about how does that get built? What's the legal basis on which you move forward? What are the policy issues that come from that? What are the geopolitical, issues that arise from people having or not having this stuff? And then that leads you ultimately to a question of, do you have to have a non-proliferation regime? A lot of this, was areas where, Henry and Graham Allison and others who were involved in a lot of the nuclear non-proliferation origins and evolution, we see some parallels, not perfect ones, but some parallels between what societies agreed to do and the benefits of doing that, even though you didn't get everybody to do it. I believe we're going to have to realize that we're, as these machines emerge, are going to have a non-proliferation regime here as well. And that's why it's urgent to not think that the companies can solve this all by themselves. The peoples of every society, they grant powers to their governments that they don't grant to companies. When I work with Microsoft or OpenAI, we could say, oh, we know how to do this, but we don't have any way of compelling people to participate. If we had a mechanism of adjudication and we thought it was just great and we were willing to give it away, how would you compel people to participate? So governments, have always had the responsibility and the power of compulsion. And in this case, some is going to be required. The idea that it's just a big happy world doesn't even apply in our own country, because you talk about the bad guys like maybe nation states or terrorists that we think are not playing by rules we like, but we have a whole lot of criminal activity in this country and in every country that says, even if you could keep this all within the confines of the United States, you need a non-proliferation regime to keep it out of the hands of the local bad guys. And and the crazy people. And to some extent, these things blur together. But what's missing right now is there's no real thinking about this broad, sequence of activities, a technical architecture, a legal basis for it, a policy basis for it, a diplomatic, activity built around it, and a conscious attempt or requirement to build a non-proliferation regime before this stuff just becomes completely wildly available to everyone. And that's, in the sense, we think we see a path to do the technical part of that. And what we don't yet see is how the governments fulfill their responsibilities, even, among a handful of them, to focus on this part of the problem, which only they can do.
Okay, so let me just say, colleagues, I'm winding down to about the last 15 minutes, but I want to get to what I think is the key, content of this book. It's really, gosh, it's a stunningly interesting book. This is back when you get to your concluding chapter on strategy, Craig, and you talk about, I mean, the subheader is the coevolution, artificial humans. I mean, humans starting to become capable of dealing with AI. And you talk about a human fusion with machines. Now there's this really frightening paragraph. I'm going to read it for the audience, and I'd like you to comment on it. This is the paragraph. Forging such links could augment our ability to communicate with machines, challenge them on their own terms, ensure that the knowledge gathered by AI is ultimately passed on to humans, and convince AI of the worth of humans as equal partners. I don't think I've ever been more frightened to read that sentence. What does that mean?
Well, as I said, we're going to go through this period of time where the super intelligent new species is here. We've brought it here. That's an important statement. It's wildly different than like in the movies you see, where the spaceship shows up overhead, and we say, oh, they got here, we didn't get there. They must be smarter than we are, but we know nothing about them. Here, we know everything about this thing because we're building it, and we haven't finished yet. So in that, it creates an opportunity, to, if we're not lazy, to buy ourselves time. And by not lazy, I mean not lazy in the way we do the engineering, but also not lazy in the way we do the governing and the policy and the diplomacy, and recognize that this thing is going to change everything about everything. And we have to get focused on that. And so in the second phase, this coexistence phase, humans kind of have to decide what we want to be when we grow up. Because, a lot of the things that have defined our societies, and our value, in the book, we call for a new definition of dignity. What is it that produces the sense of dignity in an individual? Historically, a huge part of people's dignity was their work. Whether that was raising kids or going out and plowing the fields, that there was dignity in work. But the whole question of what does work mean? What is value add in this environment? Particularly if you have direct agency, by machines, not just at an intellectual level, but at a physical level, it's going to change the nature of who does work. And does this become a period of great abundance for humans and we get to do something different? I think the answer should be yes. But we have to figure out what is that thing. And so today, it's clear already, independent of this, that humans and our amplification through our invention over time is now changing the environment in which we live and work, and at a rate where classic constructs of evolution as adjusting our species for the environment we're in is way too slow. And so, my own view is that humans will now change as a species by design. But that means we have to decide what we want to design as the improvements. I think it'll be obvious that the first set of improvements we'll do will be done under the banner of healthcare. We'll design away the things that are our current diseases because we'll be able to through the machine. The machine will understand our biology to a degree that humans cannot, all right, at a molecular level. And as a result, we can start to alter our biology and humans can evolve. But here we can evolve in ways that, are completely outside the realm of what people have considered in the past. Now, so what do we think is our ultimate relationship with these super intelligent machines? We don't know what the limits of our brain are, even as it is. They're constrained by its clock rate and the fact that we have bad input-output systems. Our resolution of our vision system, the rate at which we can speak and listen. These are all very, very slow compared to the machines. That's why there's this big gap. What should they become? We will have choice. Humans should have agency in this. And through that, you get to this period of time where, we should be able to then determine what is the long-term relationship that we want between the human species as modified and the machine species, which is evolving alongside us and helping us to get to whatever future we want. I think that if you think, you have people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk who are right out there today saying, oh, humans should be a spacefaring species. Jeff talks about, thinking that we should have, our goal should be to have about 1 trillion humans. He says they just won't all fit on Earth, but we should be out beyond Earth. But of course, our bodies were only, evolved to operate on this rock. And if you and all your offspring were going to spend the rest of your life in space, why wouldn't you adjust yourself for space? It'll probably be possible to do that. And so I think these are the deep, long-term philosophical questions, and show why, the status quo will not be maintained. And that whether that takes 100 years or 50 or 200, who knows? What we do know is that and it goes back to your opening question, the rate of discovery is going to go up dramatically sometime in the next few years. The Dario Amodei, who was at OpenAI when I first met him, and then he formed Anthropic, recently wrote a paper where he personally estimates that once the AGI starts to be fully functional, let's say in 3 to 5 years, that the rate of scientific and engineering advance will improve quite quickly by about 20 times. And so he says, if you think about that, it means everything that humans, as we are today, would have done in this century will be done by 2035.
Yeah.
And so, these, they posit change at a level that we can't readily contemplate.
Yeah, if Craig Mundie were in charge of this, I would feel fine. What happens if an Adolf Hitler had a AI tool? He wanted to engineer the Ubermensch. What happens?
Well, that is our challenge as humans right now, or at least, the likelihood is that the two countries that are going to get closest to this capability fastest are the US and China.
Mm-hmm.
And as you may know, and I think we comment in the book, one of the last things Henry devoted his time to, besides the book, was driven by what we were doing in the book. And that was his final trip ever, which was to China to meet with President Xi. And at least Henry's part of that meeting was devoted to the question of artificial intelligence and what the ramifications were going to be from it.
Yeah.
Because, as perhaps the longest trusted interlocutor between the US and China, he wanted the president of China to understand that this was a fundamentally transformational time, and that the things that we're all focused on today will largely pale into insignificance, relative to the effects of the arrival of these super machines.
So we're really right down to the last minutes here, Craig. Let me, the last part of the book talks about what do we do as a human race to deal with this. Why don't you summarize what your thoughts are about what we should be doing?
Well, first, I think we should have a concerted effort, I'll say a multipolar effort, as much as we can, to develop an AI that can be the adjudication system. And, I've done enough technical work and experimentation now to believe that that is doable. But it's not something that any one of the companies can do for itself. And it has to be done in a way where it's applicable to all companies that want to produce capabilities like this. And through that, you can adjudicate many things. You can adjudicate all forms of laws and regulations. You can teach it the doxa. You can have it, you can have it in your weapon system, that basically says, you should behave not just according to the conventions and laws that we have, but, by some other moral grounding too. And if that thing is riding your drone, in some way, then it's no different than having a man in the loop. All right. It's just the man has now delegated it, because it comes to trust that all the things that we value and think are important and have codified in law can be placed in an AI. This is, again, a polymathic problem for which the machine is extremely well suited and humans are not. So, for example, one thing I know is that no one is going to produce a rule set and the whole world, or any even two countries, are going to immediately agree to say, yeah, that's my rule set. But happily, the AI doesn't require that, because in context, it can find the path between rule sets, on a dynamic basis. Because unlike a human, it can know all the rule sets simultaneously. It's just another high-dimensional problem. And so, it brings with it a capability in adjudication that humans don't have. And so I think we have to get focused on that. If there was going to be people euphemistically talk about having a Manhattan Project to get AI, I think what we need, we're going to get AI, whether we like it or not.
Right.
The Manhattan Project we need is a bunch of polymathic people who come together to create the adjudicator, if you want to call it that. And then the next thing the governments have to do is they have to say, yeah, at least a coalition of the willing are going to build around that concept. We're going to use it uniformly. We're going to use it to support trade and interaction. We'll build trust amongst us through this common mechanism of development. What that leaves behind is those who don't want to play. So, and there I think that you have to begin a process that's a bit like any other non-proliferation regime, where, you basically use diplomacy and, whatever mechanisms you have to try to both create those that are in the club and those that are not in the club. And I think there's definitely ways to bring to bear even the fruits of the AI, to aid in that process. And then we go on. But at least, those last things can only be done if the governments are going to get serious about this conceptually. And right now, it's not the focus of any government.
Well, that's a ringing call. You've just described the first AI Geneva Conventions, where we establish rules that people widely understand, and then we have to try to keep people to feel that that's a norm for the rest of us.
Well,
Craig,
I think it's important to fine tune your statement just a little bit. It's essential in my mind that what we get agreement on is the architecture of adjudication. That's different than saying a priori you have to agree on some convention or rule set. That can be a longer term goal. If I had the same mechanism, at least between, pick any two countries, the US and the UK, or the US and China, or the US and Canada, pick any two or three. If we at least agree to an architecture that allows our rules to be uniformly employed when you're in our space, but we could have common AI products, that would be a lot more like what happened when we built the early PCs and shipped them all over the world. The PCs, actually, we did a huge amount of work at Microsoft to teach them how to speak in 39 languages, and to, be able to write left to right and right to left and up and down and every other way, because they had to go into those places and fit within those cultures and environments. We also had to fit within their legal systems. And, so it's a tiny, tiny example in comparison, but that can be done now. And these are the best tools we've ever had to contemplate, first, an architecture to which you can incrementally add people's rules, and then operationally and through more diplomacy and more history, maybe the rules can converge into conventions that people would live with.
Well, an architecture of adjudication. You've just sent me back to the book. I need to read the last chapter again, Craig. Thank you. This has been this is a remarkable book, colleagues. I mean, again, it's called Genesis in Artificial Intelligence, Hope, and the Human Spirit. Craig Mundie, this has been quite an interesting experience for me, and I'm so glad to have this opportunity to be back with you. Thank you.
Great, John. Well, it's good, and maybe we can pick up where we left off back in the 90s, and help move people in a direction they weren't planning on going.
I wasn't smart enough to know in the 1990s I was on that journey, but I'm glad I did it with you. Craig, thank you. Thank you for taking the time, John, to be with us. This is a wonderful experience. I appreciate it very much. Wish you the best.
It's great to see you. Bye-bye.
Take care.